A global economic collapse is certain. It's simply a matter of time. It is, of course, intentional to consolidate power. As wealth is built up by the masses, it is siphoned off and funneled towards the globalists. In anticipation of the collapse, many wealthy people have been buying large amounts of land and homes in particular destinations which are regarded as safe. Let's look into some of those now. You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Today we will look into this situation that many people have asked me about. Where do I go to be safe? I'm concerned for myself, for my family. I want to know, where do I have to move? Should I move? And every area has their own pros and cons, their own safe areas and unsafe areas. This is not a definitive list. This is not every detail about every location. This is just some points, some areas that have some benefits or negatives, which I will get into now. So, without further ado, let's look at this. Starting with what I believe to be probably the most safe. The one that continuously comes up in my research. One that billionaires are constantly buying up large amounts of land and building these armored shelters, massive, for themselves, for their families. And that is New Zealand. New Zealand generally seems to be one that the billionaires have been flocking to, that they've been building these bases, these bunkers in this location. It is far enough away from most of the world, and it does have its own ability to be self-contained, self-sufficient. It can produce what it needs on its own. That's a good thing in a very deep crisis scenario. Now, having said that, it's not foolproof. None of these places are foolproof. And remember that as I go along here, I'm not saying that, any of these are a bulletproof idea. This is just some things for myself to share. Australia being nearby, obviously a big partner with it, has its benefits and negatives, but I definitely do see them as partners, so there isn't a concern in that regard. When we look to the north, we see this area here, and unfortunately, much of this area doesn't seem to be as safe, and I would generally suggest that this area be off limits. There's good, there's bad, but generally, the governments tend to be very unstable as a whole. When you look to China, definitely I would argue against China, but something to a less degree when you see the Singapore obviously having a relatively strong currency, growth potential there, but it's in a region that generally I would say is unsafe. Look at Japan, look at North Korea being in this area. You know that whether it's the disaster from Fukushima poisoning the earth, and you also have the problems, of course, with the tensions that are in this area, whether it's the disputes over the South China Sea, Japan and China not looking eye to eye on that. You have North Korea in that area as well. You have, I believe it was The Economist, suggesting that the Pakistan-India border is the most dangerous in the world, leaving both of these nations off limits. You start to get into the Middle East regions, which are, of course, quite frankly, bedlam, total bedlam, leaving these nations unacceptable as well. You have the issue with Africa, massive amounts of poverty. There are other areas, of course, which are, heavily filled with resources. But due to corruption, due to everything that has happened, in these different areas, they generally, unfortunately, become regarded as unsafe. As a result of everything that's been happening in Africa, particularly North Africa, there has been the migrant flows coming in through areas like Greece and like Italy. This has been causing some destabilization, which also leads to the areas of Europe becoming dangerous as well. There is, though, one country that is generally regarded as safe, and that is a small one, right smack dab in the middle, and that is Switzerland. Switzerland is a fortress. Switzerland, despite its location, has the ability to be extremely strong, both economically. It has a very strong currency. It has the ability to withstand economic crisis. It is a stronghold. So that would be a potential refuge in the European area. Very important. When we look to the north, we have Scandinavia, which isn't without its flaws, but I would say that, Scandinavia generally is seen to be safer than much of the rest of Europe. It has, economically, the currencies, the political aspects as well. Generally, you would have these as being possibly the only options for Europe that I would recommend. Scandinavia, Switzerland. That would be it. When you look to the east, Russia, I can't recommend it, although over the last, let's say, 20 years, definite growth potential there. There is much more, I would say, use the term democratic almost, coming out of there, inching slowly towards that. At this time, I'm not going to suggest it. Let's move over to Iceland, because I believe that this is a country that could potentially be working towards being much better in the decades that follow. We saw what happened with the financial crisis and everything after, and that does give it good potential. I also see it regionally, geographically, as being something that is a good thing. It's sort of away from everybody and towards an area where I would say is regarded as being safe in terms of geography. Canada is one of those countries which can be seen as safe or very unsafe. When you look at the heavily populated areas of Toronto, right here, or you look at BC, these are potential problems in the future. Major cities, overpopulated, sprawling cities that just go on and on. Millions of people living in an area sharing very few resources. It is dangerous. But you look at the rest of it and you look at an area that is, there's so much fresh water available in Canada, and that is such a critical resource that makes it very valuable. They also have tons of other resources in Canada which are very beneficial. So Canada is one of those that I would say has both, has the unsafe, has the safe. And they have resources, that's key, that's very important. But of course, it's along the border of the US, which could present the problem in the future at some point. If there's destabilization in the US, that will make its way through the border, just as what could happen on the Mexico and US border. So you could very well believe that California or Texas or anything is safe, but any sort of problems will show themselves in a northern direction. That's the concern. The United States has different areas which I believe that could be seen as safe. A lot of areas, many have suggested areas in the north, whether that's Minnesota, North Dakota, things like this, could be seen as safer areas. Before I get a little more into my explanation, I wanted to just break down the fact that I do believe that Hawaii, just like Canada, could be seen as safe and unsafe, whether you have, these areas where you have the military side, obviously not a good thing because they want to be in between, using it sort of as an outpost to be in between China, Japan, those type of areas where you have the Pacific Ocean in between. They have a major military base going on there, Pearl Harbor, the story. That's a concern, but then at the same time you have massive amounts of land. Mark Zuckerberg, for example, buying in Kauai. This is the type of dual sides to the whole thing, and it presents a problem, presents obviously something of an opportunity where you have relatively cheap land available in an area that is self-sufficient. You can be very self-sufficient in Hawaii. So it's got those both sides. Okay, you looked at the Caribbean, where you have some areas in the Caribbean which are good. You do have a lot of natural disasters, hurricanes obviously forming in the area, which is year after year presenting itself a problem. You see things like the banking establishments which are there, which are present, which are a good thing in general, bringing a little bit of a good economy to these places. But there also is high poverty and generally high crime in these regions. You have a big problem of drug trade happening within Central and South America. So whether it is coming from Colombia or other areas, Nicaragua and everything else, you have violence, you have drugs, a lot of this coming through there. But then you have the example of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is seen as a place where, they don't have an army. They have safety, seemingly, in this area, geographically. But it's amongst others that are seen as being unsafe. So it's a little hit and miss in there. But for those who sort of want that living off-grid, living without the government safety net, Costa Rica is something that is very good. Then we move south to a country that is, some would consider to be the safest in South America, and that is Chile. It is a country that economically has done quite well, despite the region that it's in, and it has, weather-wise, tends to be very good. Any area that is overpopulated, like Santiago, could be a problem, though, of course. No different than the rest. This is one country that was recommended years ago, and I first heard about this from Bob Chapman. Many of you may know Bob Chapman. I spoke to Bob Chapman, actually, a very nice individual. He's no longer with us, but anyway, suggested Chile as being one of those, and I believe he also suggested Uruguay. I believe it was Uruguay, not Paraguay. And although I personally don't know too much about Uruguay, and generally South America, obviously, being a region that it has a long way to go, I do believe. But if you're looking into this region, it has its benefits because of, with the Fukushima disaster and everything, being a lot better. So it's sitting in the southern hemisphere, positions it well. So like I said, every region has its own benefits, has its own negatives, and we need to look at that. We need to address all of that. I haven't covered everything. I probably ranted too much, but I hope you do appreciate that. Understand that these regions are, what I would say is, beneficial for some things, like its geography. When you look at an area like New Zealand, perhaps you would suggest like Hawaii or Iceland. It's isolated areas that may be good for what you believe. And you want to have stability in your life. That's what everyone seeks to have. So areas like this, you want to be able to have that, but at the same time, maybe you have other other things, other priorities. People can't just pick up and go. I can't just decide, okay, well, I'm going to live in New Zealand tomorrow. How long can you live there? Countries have visas that you have to get, and they are a limited amount of time, travel restrictions. There's all kinds of problems. But in practically every country that we live in, there are safer areas. And the point that I want to make is you could live, let's take New York, for example. If you're living in Manhattan, you're in the areas which are risky, which are dangerous. If you live in Toronto and Vancouver and San Francisco and LA and anything, you live in areas where there are, once again, too many people, too many resources. The globe, the earth, doesn't have that problem because you can grow your own food. You can produce enough food for yourself, for your family. You can take care of that. But you need to have land. You need a little bit of land. And those areas are available. You drive maybe even as little as an hour outside of the major cities, most major cities, and you have areas that I would say are safe, relatively safe. There's not much people around. People have their own land. They are safe. They don't want to deal with all of the nuisances and the headaches of these major cities. There would seem to be safer. And then you have the ability to be self-sufficient. You can have your own solar panels. You can have your own garden. You can grow your own cattle or have your own chickens and everything else. You can have that. So what I'm trying to say is that you can get to a region, in the region near you now, or somewhere else that you desire. And it doesn't have to be all the way in New Zealand or Switzerland or Iceland or northern Canada. You don't have to do that. You can get more safety than where you are if you're in the big metropolis, moving to a region which I would say is safe or safer. Now, if you found this video informative, then please give me a thumbs up. Last but not least, if you found the video informative, you'll find my other work even more informative because you can check out everything for free. I have a free e-course. I've got free ebooks and countless videos, over 1,000 videos available on YouTube. You could check all of that out at themoneygps.com.